Welcome back to Conversations for the Good. Hello, Dr. Jane.
Hi, Anna. How are you today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, thanks. I'm delighted to be here again.
Oh, so am I. Always delighted to be with you, Dr. Jane. We've discussed in recent conversations the topics of fear, stress, and even the creation of the backstory, which all led us to today's touchy topic of anger. Given the reactivity that is so prevalent in these unprecedented times, I was hoping we could look more closely at your insights on anger.
Well, Anna, this is a this is a juicy topic because it is so individual and it's so personal. And really, that's why we needed to talk about the backstory um, in our last episode to really begin to put together the framework for how we can own our anger, putting it into context about how we formulate it, both our thoughts and also interpretations of what's happening in the moment and how it is being processed within us. So the subject tends to be very wide and it tends to be very deep. For our purposes today, I really want to stay with more of the uh, biological dimensions of anger and also the emotional dimensions of anger. We'll touch upon some other things, but I really want us to be able to begin to identify our own personal relationship with anger, the ways that it might be triggered, and also how to recalibrate anger rather than having it escalate when we are triggered.
Yes, Dr. Jane, I know anger is an extremely deep and complicated emotion and can certainly be uncomfortable to experience it or to be around someone who's angry.
Mhm. Well, and this is where it tends to be misunderstood, Anna, because it is uncomfortable to be around anger very often, unless you're on the side of someone who is angry and you are being triggered as they are. But anger is so often associated with aggression, which isn't necessarily the case. You know, anger is a vital sign that tells us there's something terribly wrong, and it tends to run on a continuum from of intensity from mild irritation all the way to full blown rage. And one way to understand anger is to really kind of see it within the context of all the emotions. We all tend to experience the emotions to a greater or lesser degree, anywhere from the main primary emotions tend to be fear and sadness, joy, trust, anticipation, disgust, and last but not least, anger. So anger has a relationship to each one of these emotional states.
Yeah, this is so important for us to understand. So anger stands alone as an emotion, but also has a relationship with other emotions. Can you explain how this works?
Sure, Anna. Let's just take fear. Fear is that biological experience that we have, the biological reaction that triggers that fight or flight response. It's really about safety. It's where the primitive part of the brain very often overrides logic and reason. With fear, we get a direct hit of anger because anger is that defensive momentum that allows us to kind of put our dukes up to protect ourselves. It's an attempt to set a boundary. Anger assures our safety and it helps us guard against a personal loss. So it's really that kind of dukes up phenomena when we have that sense of threat or fear.
Yeah, that makes sense, Dr. Jane. So how does sadness and anger, how are they related?
Well, with sadness, very often we're not comfortable with feeling that particular emotion. So anger can be a way to really kind of hide or displace sadness or any other uncomfortable feeling. I can avoid the discomfort of my sadness, and yet I can also maintain a sense of control. Because with sadness, very often, there's a certain kind of a vulnerability or weakness that we feel. But with anger, it's like when I'm triggered, I really feel more puffed up. I feel more in control. I feel bigger. And then we have joy. And with joy, anger shows itself usually when joy dissipates. It's at that place where joy is starting to fade and we're not able to reinstate it. And then my anger very often shows up as a defensiveness around that particular sense of loss.
It sounds like we need to hang on to joy as long as we can, right?
I think you're right, Anna. I think you're right. And then let's look at surprise, because surprise, surprises can be pleasant or they can be unpleasant. When a pleasant surprise occurs, there's the joy that tends to arise. But when it's an unpleasant surprise, we're really kind of ambushed, then fear tends to be generated. And so where there's fear generated, we're going to have the fight or flight, and the dukes are going to go up because this sets up the anger to take over.
Yeah. Well, when anger takes over, are we able to trust? I don't usually think of trust as an emotion.
Well, this is something that has been kind of added to the whole list of emotional states. And trust really is about healthy attachment. Healthy attachment, it's that healthy attachment that drives the emotion. And it's mostly designed to help us get our needs met. So it's, how do I create a safe environment that I can navigate within? So the violation of trust can be very, very damaging. When we think about those who maybe have experienced traumatic experiences and the wound has not really, been healed, they tend to be more sensitive. There's often we see anger showing up when there's a violation of trust as an adaptive response. So it really is to protect myself. It's not that it's negative at all, but it's really coming up to protect myself. So it can be very, very adaptive. And even in anticipation, anticipation can have a positive and negative component to it. If it's something that I'm looking forward to, that's great, but it can also be tied to a negative kind of experience. And so if I'm anticipating something that is unpleasant or uncomfortable, that can really trigger the anxiety within me. And where there's anxiety, that's a fear-based emotion, then I'm going to want to protect myself. So again, it's that defensiveness that comes up and really allows me to move into an environment where I can feel some safety. And sometimes that environment is my own defensiveness.
Yes, well, thank you for explaining these emotions and how they connect to anger. So trust, anticipation, and disgust are the basic types of emotions.
And yes, and let me say something about disgust, because sometimes disgust is an easier one to understand, because when I'm repulsed by something, it just kind of fits that that's going to be a negative component, in an experience. And so of course I'm going to want to defend myself against that. I'm going to want to back up, and I'm going to want to back away from, and also back that thing or situation away, because I don't want to be close to it. I am being repulsed by it. So I want to have that, pushed aside. The interesting thing about this is that if this is prolonged, that kind of disgust or not being able to get away from what is disgusting me, it can really bring up a lot of resentment, which can really fester. We'll talk about that in just a minute.
So there are so many emotions to be aware of, so many moving parts,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And these are considered the primary emotions by behavioral science today, contemporary behavioral science. But there's also a category called social emotions. And these include emotions and emotional reactions like shame and guilt, embarrassment, or even pride. And their purpose is really social survival. It's about me being acceptable within the communities that I navigate within. And to be able to move safely within the social structures that I'm required to participate in.
Wow, this is fascinating. We don't think of our emotions being tied to survival.
Well, typically we don't. And the other piece that's important to say is we also don't necessarily feel pure emotions. Usually it's a combination of emotions, happening at once. But the emotions, are all geared for our physical and our social survival. And often it's happening at such a rapid speed and such a high intensity that we're not even aware of what's happening in the moment.
Wow. So anger is one of the many signals that navigates our next decision.
That's
Where
right.
did it all,
That's
where did
right.
it all begin, Dr. Jane?
Well, it operates as a signal. The emotions are the signal. They're kind of the loudspeakers that alert us to where and how our needs need to be met or where there are potential dangers. And so it prepares us for what we need to do next, what action we need to take, um, what kind of part we need to play into any kind of decision-making process. And it also helps us navigate interpersonal relationships and interpersonal and social structures.
Wow, so anger is a normal and necessary process.
That's entirely right. Our entire physiology is really wired for survival, and anger is just a particular necessary component of that fight or flight response that prepares us for survival when we're threatened. As we've mentioned before, it's the primitive brain, and that part of the primitive brain that's called the amygdala that is on board to send the orders via hormones and electrical signals to activate the entire system to protect us. So when our safety is compromised, all systems go on alert, and even the blood flow shifts from those sophisticated parts of our brain so that we can have more energy in all the survival regions of our physiology to do whatever we need to do for safety.
Well, Dr. Jean, I can see now why anger in some cases might, have been helpful. What happens when anger turns south?
Well, anger is a pretty normal emotion, and um, it allowed our ancestors to survive. It allows us to survive. Um, it really tends to be, whether it's a single event kind of trauma or whether it's a prolonged, repetitive kind of a difficult experience, the fight or flight response can sometimes move into what we call kind of hypersensitivity. And in hypersensitivity, it can hijack the entire brain. So what once might have been an entirely adaptive response can all of a sudden, turn into a maladaptive response. So at one point in time, it could have been a rewarding response, and now all of a sudden, it can be self-defeating, or it can be a real negative response that winds up adding more problems to one's life. And there's a huge cost to anger. Very often there's a myriad of negative consequences. Things like it can erode relationships. People have, experienced loss of jobs, loss of relationships of all kinds because of the way it can intimidate and alienate. It cuts us off from other emotional resources, cuts us off from spiritual resources. It impacts our self-esteem and also our self-confidence. And because it's has such a huge hormonal impact on the physiology, it's also a key component in physical, mental, and emotional stress, which plays out in physical disorders, everything from cardiac issues to diabetes to, autoimmune diseases, the whole gamut.
Everything you just described is so impactful and playing a huge part for many people in the pandemic.
Well, I think you're right, Anna. I think you're right. And I think it becomes clearer how it plays a part in the pandemic when we talk about triggers and we talk about styles of anger, because triggers, you know, triggers so often for anger is a first kind of order of a trigger would be our sense of vulnerability. When somehow I'm feeling vulnerable, very often I interpret that as being somehow threatening or unsafe or that I'm somehow protected. So anger is a way to cover that up and to get some distance from that vulnerability. My anger says, I don't want to be open to that. I don't want to be with that. I don't want to allow that. I'm out of here. Or you're out of here.
Well, that certainly does describe what many people have been expressing.
Yes, and it also goes along with the hurt, and the sadness and the sense of loss and grief that people are experiencing. We're all experiencing in the pandemic, and also that it also touches into that longing for the return to what is normal. What life will be after the virus. Wanting to resume the life as I've known it, and also dealing with the uncertainty of we don't know what it's going to be like.
I know so many of us are longing for the return our lives prior to this virus, for sure.
Yeah.
Dr. Jane, so the triggers are all old needs that aren't being met in this unprecedented time.
Exactly. Exactly. Common triggers are associated with emotional needs that can't be met. You know, the lack of control, misinformation, lying, threats, violation of personal space, the injustices that have occurred that in our own lives, but also that we've witnessed through the news feeds, the disrespect, the insults, relationship disputes. All of these interfere with emotional needs and the sense of safety and security. And when we have these gaps, we come away with this feeling of being ignored or disrespected. Those are primary triggers for an angry defensive response.
Wow. Yeah, as you were going through the list of all the emotional needs that can't be met, I could see how all these have been triggered during this pandemic. Do you always know which one is the culprit?
Well, Anna, as I mentioned before, we don't feel very often a pure emotion, so that's just it. We don't feel that. And so, and also it happens so rapidly, and we're so often not conscious of what's happening as it's happening. It's kind of after the fact that it's like, oh yeah. So that's why it's important that as we move into being aware of the triggers, that we're asking certain questions like, why is it that I need to be angry right now? Am I operating on out of my shoulds? We talked about that last time. Those ironclad rules. That when I break those rules, somehow I'm impacted or I tend to react in some emotional way, feeling less than or threatened in some way. Also to ask myself, what needs are being compromised right now? What are the insecurities that are being triggered? What are the past wounds that are opened in this exchange right now? What past unprocessed trauma might be coming up for me? And the way we kind of see that is, how is this just like something that's happened in the past? What does this remind me of? So it's also like, how does it fit in my history? Why does it feel so dangerous? Why do I feel that I need to avoid it? This is just the beginning of the self-assessment. So it's necessary to begin with being with our reactivity, kind of seeing it and feeling it clearly, which means that we have to own it, which also means that the only way that I can hope to control my anger is not to avoid it, but to actually kind of be with it, to get to know it a little bit better so that I can have some control over it rather than it having control over me.
Yes, I can see how self-assessment is necessary, but it's easy to miss the whys, the whats, the hows.
Well,
So easy to miss these pieces.
it really is, Anna, as I say, because it happens at the speed of light. So we have to slow down enough that we can investigate our own experience of anger. The neural pathways in the brain are kind of like 8-lane superhighways, and um, they become kind of polished and refined because we're constantly using them in certain ways. It's our patterns of thinking and our conditioning. And so we're moving along these neural pathways at warp speed. And and sometimes we're not even conscious of how they're activated or when they're activated. This is why it's so important to understand, and neuroscience really supports this, that it's so important to be able to step into the moment and feel the emotion as it's arising, feel ourselves pulled into the old pattern. And in that moment, rather than allowing ourselves to be pulled directly into it, to activate a new choice. Because a new choice, a different choice, activated, really sets up a new direction of firing within the brain. So, with the new firing in the brain, we can have a possibility of a change process, but it requires focused attention. It requires us to actually step into the moment with full attention and to do something different, something that we haven't done before. So we can't avoid the unpleasantness. We have to actually step into it in order to make another choice, in order to fire the brain in another way, rewire the brain as well in another way. Yeah.
Dr. Jane, I'm curious. Not all anger looks alike. And I know when it comes out in a fury, but sometimes it's not as direct. Can you explain why and share some different types and styles of anger?
Yes, yes. They come out in a lot of different types and styles. We refer to anger out and anger in. Yeah, there's a third type that is kind of a disengagement from anger or kind of a dissociative kind of a experience with anger. So it's like it's really kind of disengaging totally. The obvious one, the fury that you're talking about, is really that anger out. That's the explosive kind of anger. A person acts it out physically, verbally, or a combination of that. This is very often what we call Jekyll and Hyde. Nice person until all of a sudden their switch is flipped and it's kind of like a glaring, explosive phenomena. There's also self-abusive kind of anger. This tends to be kind of that fury turned inward. This is that anger inward. Can be turned inward via shame or guilt about something. And it can also move into self-harm or even depression if left to of its own devices. There are also people who completely try to avoid anger.
Mm.
So these are people that really want to disconnect from it. This is also another kind of anger inward. It can kind of go underground. It can be very self-abusive. It can fester resentments kind of, because it's kind of playing out below the surface. And so we have the resentments are really that anger that is stored and fueled. And it's incredibly powerful, even though it tends to be underground. It eventually shows up in different places. It's a mighty force. Resentment is a mighty force, and it really can suck the life out of us. There's an old saying that resentment rots the container it resides in. So it's not like if I'm avoiding it, it's not like it's going anywhere. It's just I'm pushing it into more of an unconscious state. You know, the other thing to keep in mind as I turn my anger inward, very often I need to medicate it in order to keep the lid on. So for a lot of people, the way they're able to deal with the anger inward is by using all kinds of activities as medication, keeps the lid on. Alcohol, food, shopping, gambling, media, computer games. You know, it's all a way to distract myself from the real deal that's happening inside of me.
See that happening. It's so easy to think that if I'm not engaging in the conflict, that somehow that's better for everyone. Is this true?
Well, and this goes back to the myth that of that anger has to be aggressive. And so, very often, if I'm believing that anger is aggression, then someone's going to get hurt, and it could be me. So, I want to keep the lid on it. I want to do whatever it takes and accommodate whatever it takes in order to keep the distance or the lid on somebody else. There's also this other kind of anger, though, Anna, that I think is incredibly important to know about, and that is sarcasm. Because people very often think of sarcasm as humor, because it can be cloaked in humor. But it comes from the Greek word sakre, which means to tear the flesh. So there often is a real, it can be unconscious, but it is there. There's a real intention to zing somebody, to get them, to poke them, to, yeah.
Yeah, that obviously doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't. Another kind of angry reaction is passive aggressive behavior. And this is kind of an indirect anger. It's like I'm not appearing angry on the outside, and I certainly don't own it, but it comes out very often in small actions and small ways that tend to be subtle, or it could be even a tone that stings. So it's about not wanting to, and very often not wanting to let on that I'm really angry or resentful. So when I'm confronted by that and somebody says, well, what do you mean by that? That I don't have to own it. I can deny it. I can project it. I can rationalize it. Or what are you talking about? You always think that I'm angry. I didn't mean anything by that. You know, so it's a real quick kind of cover up, but the zing is there.
Yeah. Is anger ever truly positive, Dr. Jane?
Well, it's positive when it is comes from our passion to serve the greater good. This is righteous, compassionate anger. And very often it's about our willingness to stand up for something that is really important to us, something that we believe very strongly in, um, something that really serves a best and greater good, or certainly when I'm looking to defend myself or I'm defending loved ones, or sometimes it's not even loved ones. I mean, we have people who really engage in heroic acts and they're really defending strangers, people that they've never met before. So it's all in what the intention is, what's the initiating energy. You know, social activism is another example. Sometimes finding our, what I call finding our voice, capital V, where I'm willing to stand up for something and say, no, that's not right, or no, you must never do that again, or no, I won't tolerate that behavior. Again, it is this kind of individual heroism that allows us to have kind of an outrageous, righteous rage that really kind of pumps us up so that we can do things that we might not normally do. You know, whether it's for me or you're mistreating somebody, someone's being mistreated, and I stand up for them and say, no, 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 I won't allow you to do that.
So we've covered the different ways that we express anger. Now, how do we change the reactivity?
Well, if you're serious about changing the reactivity, there are no half measures. It's a real commitment. It begins with learning how to be aware in the moment. It learns, we have to learn how to recognize and label sensory changes as they're happening, as they're actually occurring. Noticing the shifts in my breathing, noticing the tension in my chest, noticing the constriction in my throat. Because if I rely on my thinking, I'm already there. And once I'm there, it's so easy to justify it because that's my backstory, really kind of pushing through to the end. So I have to be able to recognize it as soon as it happens. So it's about focusing on my sensing, sensing into the body, rather than relying on my cognitive functioning, my thinking. And next, we have to allow the reactivity to play out a little bit in my experience. This isn't acting it out and it's not fueling it. It's really about turning toward it so that I can observe it, so that we can hold the experience in our awareness and inquire into it. To know, how is this, how is this related to my beliefs or my backstories? So it's cultivating this kind of a neutral position in my consciousness that allows me to watch and to witness what are the ingredients that are going into this particular angry episode. So really investigating with a sense of curiosity, and I also suggest with a sense of kindness, and acknowledging the experience with compassion. This isn't about judging ourselves, and it's not about I have to. It doesn't mean to make it right in the moment. It really is about just letting myself know what's really happening and what parts of me are being triggered, the old and also the newer parts.
So if we want to change reactivity, these are the steps to really get to know
That's right.
What the anger is all about, where it may have come from, and what keeps it alive, right?
It's necessary as a first step um, to invest ourselves in the process of really figuring out what are the ingredients. And it requires us stepping out of that cognitive, conceptual framework that we're so accustomed to and we're so conditioned to use in every situation. It's kind of like having a hammer and thinking that's going to do every job. The cognitive and conceptual are really stellar at certain problem solving situations, but in understanding ourselves, we really need to step into another way of knowing. And this allows us to move into the current reactivity within the context of our backstory, but not on a conceptual level. We have to step into another way of knowing. This is the sensing kind of knowing. It's the intuition or wisdom way of knowing, which doesn't happen on a conceptual cognitive basis.
Can you give us an example of how this might look, sound, or feel?
Well, let's just take, for instance, that I just had a really dreadful phone call. And so I just get off the phone and I'm in full-fledged, plug me in like a Christmas tree reactivity. And the first thing I want to do is I want to drop into my breath, because the breath leads the way to any kind of sensing, all right? Because if I go to my head right now, I'm going to have a list. I'm going to have an inventory of how they did and what they did and how I did it. You know, I can feel it. I can feel that kind of revving up just talking about the possibility. So it's about allowing myself to drop into, out of my thinking, out of all the interpretations that I'm in the moment. Focus on my breath, which takes me out of the cognitive process. Allow myself to hopefully just kind of sit down, breathe easily, notice any tension in my body. Just kind of notice where there is the most tension. Very often for me, I feel it in my throat, my chest. Very often, my gut will be doing flip-flops. And just breathing with that. Just allowing myself nice, easy breaths, noticing the tension in my abdomen. And very often as we just drop in and start to feel the physical kind of sensations, very often certain things will percolate up. It might be that I'm feeling a little bit of shame about how I responded or how I acted or how I felt. Maybe not. Maybe I'm feeling a justification. In any case, I want that to continue to move. I don't want to settle and focus on anything. I really want to sense into my body.
Yeah.
Noticing that there's a conversation in my head that wants to draw me back into justification. And just staying with my body. Just staying with my body. And then the other thing that I might want to do is I might want to say, am I open? Am I open? Is there another way that this could have been handled? Is there another thing that I could do now rather than playing into what's being triggered? Can I be open to another way? Because this tends to formulate around what feels right about being angry right now. Is the story that I'm telling myself true? Is it something that belongs in a memory? Is it a defensiveness that just kind of happens when I'm feeling like a certain need is not being met? So this is all a quieting process, but I'm actually sitting with the reactivity. I'm not trying to avoid it, but I'm going to the real core of it, and that is the sensing part, my body's reaction. So this is really the first step. It's about focusing on the breath. Well, first of all, we want to acknowledge that I am in anger, and then it's focusing on the breath, and then continue to scan the body and noticing what comes up. This is a quieting technique. Very often we call it a 3-minute breathing space because it unplugs us from, that sense of being triggered, our reactivity, and allows us to re-engage with our awareness via our sensing, via another way of knowing.
As I said before, that's one of my favorites, that 3-minute breathing space. Dr. Jane, this is the first step. So what's involved in actually changing the brain?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, no long-term change of the brain can happen if I sort of want to maybe change. It really does require commitment. And the two components, very, very straightforward, simple components, not easy necessarily, but simple, are focused attention and repetition. Focused attention is that purposeful, deliberate, intentional practice of learning how to bring myself into the moment, present moment awareness, which is a particular state of mind that I can create via intention. And all of the change process that any of us want to engage in requires focused attention. We have to be willing to do more than just the minimum, which means we have to be in that process of engaging ourselves. And this is where the second component comes in, repetition. We have to be willing to be in sustained attention to doing things another way again and again and again. So it's about practice, 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 not just doing the practice as because somebody else thinks I should be doing it, or I want to change for them. It really has to be a personal investment. So we're not eradicating any kind of negative from somebody else. It really is um, looking at what's negative within myself, eradicating that as best I can, but also installing positives, installing desired behaviors, desired thought processes. What is the ideal? Where do I want that to come from?
I'm sure there are huge payoffs to these components.
Well, the payoff is that we can create compassion, that we can let go of resentment so we can build new responses. And the peace of mind that comes with that is priceless. The other thing that happens as we begin to make these changes, it also changes our brain structure so that we can actually increase our sense of self-compassion and compassion for others merely by doing regular quieting techniques. These kind of focused meditation, or what people very often call mindfulness meditation, really shift the structure of the brain because it activates a part of the brain called the insula, which is in charge of that human connection.
Well, Dr. Jane, when and how do we start?
Well, we start with, I always like to start when I'm talking about any high emotional states, I like to start with a 3-minute breathing space. And we have a clip that we're going to be including in the next week showing the 3-minute breathing space. And the other piece that I often advise people to learn and practice, not just when you're angry, but to practice it in between because it can be very quieting, is an energy technique called the blowout or expelling the venom. And it's particularly good when we have heightened emotional anxiety or heightened emotional anger, because it allows us to move with the energy and then to release it. And it's both in using the energy and it's also using intention, because energy tends to follow thought and intention. So it's about letting go. And we'll be doing more and more of the quieting techniques and also the energy techniques and highlighting which kinds of emotional states they're best used for, Anna.
I'm really looking forward to that and sharing them with everyone. This has been an amazing journey through anger. And Dr. Jane, you have done a wonderful job, as always, taking us through and detailing how everyone can overcome their struggles with any form of anger in a healthy way. So I want to thank you for that. Our next conversation we discussed, it would be important to talk about focused attention.
Anna, I think so, because this is one of the imperatives if people are really committed to a change process. So it's the fundamental first step. And it's simple and straightforward. All it requires is practice, and practicing it in an appropriate way, in the right way, and really allowing ourselves to experience how it taps into a myriad of situations in any 24-hour period.
Wow. Well, Dr. Jane, as you would say, stay tuned.
More will be revealed.
Be revealed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
I look forward to our next conversation.
I will as well.